All right, up next. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Deborah.
Oh, yeah. I think we also wanted to plug, just friendly reminder, keep the questions coming in. They're really awesome. You can also tag Azure Cosmos DB Conf in your social media, and we'll be responding there as well. For our next speaker, speaking of the emulator and local development, we've got Shawn Wildermuth, who is a filmmaker, instructor, Microsoft MVP at Wilder Minds LLC. He will be talking about how to use the Cosmos DB emulator for development. Welcome, Shawn.
Hey there. How are you doing today?
Good. Great to see you. Thanks for joining.
Great. Are we on?
You're on.
You're on.
Oh, well, I'm glad everyone's here. I hope you're getting all your Cosmos DB info today. I'm going to be talking about more nuts and bolts about how to use the emulator for development. About me, you probably can see all this, or go to wildermuth.com. You'll see all the same information, so I won't belabor that. We only have about 25 minutes, so I'm going to try to be quick. For me, when I'm developing a Cosmos DB project, and I did this most recently with some nonprofits, and I wanted to be able to develop locally because I was going to be changing schemas a lot. I wanted to clear and rebuild data and all of that, and of course, not having to burn instance money while you're doing this is really helpful. And there's a tool called the Cosmos DB emulator, and it runs locally on your machine. It's not a replacement or like SQLite for Cosmos DB. It is missing a number of the features that you'll get from the full service, but for development, I haven't run into any limitations. It exposes a web interface for you to manage the instance, which I find really helpful. And then it runs on Windows natively. It's an installer, but it's also available on Linux and Mac as a container. And so let's get into the nuts and bolts of it. First of all, if you go to the documentation for installing the emulator, and I'll have a link to that a little later with a shorter link than this Docs Cosmos emulator, local emulator. This will walk you through getting the emulator and then how to run it. Let me just make this quiet. I always forget this last piece. Sorry about that, everyone. And it will talk about the differences and show you how to install it here. Of real importance is if you're working on Linux or Mac, it's going to walk you through how to actually do the emulator. There's a few different steps here that make it a little bit more difficult because the emulator doesn't run on Linux or Mac hardware, so you're going to be emulating, you're going to be running it in a container. So it may not be quite as easy to install for Mac and Linux. I hope they're working on that. I don't have any answers about that, but it is something that I think is really useful. And so when you have it running, it'll be here in the tray, and typically it will launch this UI when you start it up. I have had it running for days here now, so I'm going to actually open up, right-click the option here and open up the emulator. This just opens it up on a local port. And this is, this home page of the emulator is going to tell you where it's installed. And so you can see there's a Mongo connection string, there's a primary connection string, and then URI or primary key, depending how you're connecting to it. So if we go here, and see this entire connection string, we can actually copy this directly into a Visual Studio instance. So I have a little web page here that shows some film information. And I have in app settings just connection strings. I can just paste that into the connection string. And you've seen a lot of code here, so I won't belabor it too much. But essentially, I'm using this connection string to connect to the Cosmos clients in C#, though this doesn't matter what platform you're working with. And so if we run this real quick, it should completely fail out. Let's see if it actually did that. Sorry about that. Let me just change the default browser. See if I can click on the wrong thing 6 times instead of 5 times. There we go. And so immediately I'm going to get an error in here. Well, I told you that there was this connection string, so we're connecting to it correctly. But the problem is if we come over here into Cosmos DB and click on the Explorer, there's no databases, there's no containers, and most importantly, there's no actual data here. And this makes it pretty easy. You could certainly do this through code, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new database. And this database I'm going to be calling L, which is some of the data I'm using. And you can specify some things. I'd leave it as default. And then within here, I can go ahead and create a new container for my data. So I'm going to use the existing one and just call this films. Now, you've heard a lot of people talk about the partition key and how important it is not to do cross-partition queries and such. My data set's fairly small, so I'm just going to use a partition key of year, which when we look at the data, you'll see how this is done. It's a collection of years that relate to the films that have been tested by the Bechtel test. And so now we have the films. Now, what do we actually do with them? If I click on the items, you'll see there's nothing really here, of course, because it's just a container. And this is one of the things I really like, is I can go ahead and upload an item directly from JSON, and I'll do that. Uploading this, and let's see what happens. Because I have objects, you'll see it said it created 44 objects, and let's tell it to refresh. Whoops. Why isn't it loading those? It said it created a number of them. Let's find out. I'm going to do the hard thing, and that is refresh the whole thing. There they are. And you see we have a key here, and if we click on it, we'll get that individual instance. So even though I sent it in as a collection or an array of objects, it's inserted it as individual objects that I can now actually call. And so let's go back to our Visual Studio. And let's restart this. Go clockwise to make it speed up. Still does not like it. Resource not found. What did you do wrong, Shawn? I just ran through this demo too. Oh. I don't know why I had the wrong name in here for the container. Now we can see we have all this data directly from Cosmos DB, directly from the emulator, and not really that big a deal. You can see I'm using the SQL query, SQL syntax here. And one of the things I like about the emulator that is important to see is you can actually create your own queries. So let's create a new query, and it starts out with one that will work through the SQL API. And right now, it's only the SQL API that works in here for queries. We can see we're getting all of our data back. And we can go ahead and test out our SQL queries here as well. So, for example, if I just wanted to actually get the films, I could add into here, and let's say films join. Let me make this a little bigger so you guys can see it in the back. Join films on c.films. And here I'm going to say value so that I'm getting a collection of those films. And let's see if I did this right. Let's try to get just the title. I believe that's it. And that should work. Okay, let's find out why. On. In. How did none of you tell me I had put in instead of on? I don't know what to do with you guys. So here I have the collection, which is just the titles. If I remove this as films, I can go ahead and execute just to get the entire objects as well. Or I could even do all sorts of, much more complicated queries by using where clauses. And so, let's say, let's get all the films where C dot year equals 2013, which is the last year I have data for. So there were 99 in 2013, and we can see all the data to it. And notice we're getting the object back, not the object with all of its other data, because we're using value here. I'm sure a bunch of other speakers have talked about the query syntax, so I won't belabor it too much. Another one of the important ideas here is that you could certainly manage the Cosmos DB emulator here, but there's no real good add-in into Visual Studio to manage in, so I tend to do it all here. But you can yeah, that was the right one. You can in Visual Studio Code manage it as well. If you have the Azure extension added, you can actually add it from the databases. And so if you use the extension for Azure, let me just show you where to get that. It's called Azure Tools. Whoops. It is called, no. There's my filter installed. It's called, where is it? Azure Databases. So I have this installed so we can look at databases, and obviously Cosmos DB is one of them. And you can sign into Azure and look at the databases you have on your account, but if you're using the emulator and you look at this attached database account, you can actually attach the emulator. And it depends on which way you want to access it. I'm going to say core, and because it's on our local machine, it actually can find it right away. And in this way, you can actually look at the documents themselves as well. So here we can see each of these years' documents here without having to fight through and do things. And what's interesting here is, let's go to a document, and let's call this the Unflux 2 Boogaloo. Oops, too many quotes. And by making this change here in Visual Studio Code, it'll ask me, always upload this one, and I'm going to go ahead and upload it. And it's actually going to make that change. If we come back to the emulator and change this to 2005, execute the query, we'll see that that change was actually affected in the database server for us as well. I would never do this to a live database, but for the emulator, this can really help you tweak and change the kinds of data you're going to be dealing with, so that you have a sort of a well-known piece here, that you have your sample data that you're going to be running with maybe a small data set, so you can have that development experience be pretty quick. And that's why I think, the emulator, not only for that UI situation, but here in the SQL emulator for Azure, I just think it's great. I just really, it's a great way to get it into the project. And you can even import a document into the collection directly from here and not have to use the web UI at all. So it really depends on which way is going to be more comfortable for you. In the projects I've worked with, there's always been sort of this base set of objects we want to have inside. Some of it's lookup, some of it's other sorts of collections, but also the ability to very quickly set up your default collections that you're going to use in your development experience. And that becomes super easy either in the UI or here in the Azure database extension. So here, if we just put S as a new collection, and I say test ID, well, ID is an awful idea, test region, start it with a default, this new test object appears. Of course, we don't have any documents. We can actually create documents directly from here as well as import it into a collection. And so if you're using Azure Cosmos DB and you want to use it in development without ever having to open up the Azure portal to create a default instance, this is a great way to handle that. Nope. And so any questions, and I'll show you some links that are going to be important to that. I think we're running a bit early. Ooh.
Hey, Shawn.
Hey there. I would talk faster on these things than I expect to.
Thanks for walking us through the demo element. I was holding my breath there as you were refreshing that last browser page.
It happens to me every time. Luckily, I'm not spooked by it any longer.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
And that, everyone watching on this call hopefully sees that I go through some of the same problems that you will at some point. And so, I'm going to tell you that I did it on purpose so that it was a learning experience, but that would be a lie.
Yeah, I really loved your walkthrough of the emulator. So for folks watching at home, that is exactly how the portal looks like. That the UI that Shawn was showing is exactly how the portal looks like today. So you can get started developing for free and just use that connection string that we provide and just test out your applications and see how Cosmos DB works before starting any other full subscription. And then once you're ready, you can move over to that.
Because it doesn't require you to even have signed up for Azure to start working with the Cosmos DB. So the entry point to just testing out some ideas before you commit to using Cosmos DB or any of that is pretty low. So that if you're prototyping something to talk your boss into it, this is a great way to get started without having to get into the more heavy things, even though, it would be free, but it's a matter of there's a learning curve to the portal as well. And if you just want to start writing some code, this is a great way to do it.
Definitely. No Azure subscription, Azure account. All of our client SDKs are also open source on GitHub. So you can also just grab the latest drop of those, change the connection string, and get going.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I also liked how you showed the Azure Databases extension in VS Code, which is also a great tool for you to manage all of your Cosmos DB accounts or even your emulator resources on there. And you can just right-click, create a new account, or right-click, change different things directly from your VS Code, so you don't have to do too much context switching. And it's really convenient. What has been your experience so far with that extension?
It's been great. I've mostly used it with the emulator, to be honest with you, but my experience with managing the couple of instances I have out there of Cosmos DB on my personal projects has been super smooth. Super smooth. The humanitarian toolbox project that I've been working with Cosmos for a while on, we mostly use the emulator, and then one of the folks that is managing the IT migrates the data up to Azure as we have new releases.
Cool.
Go
Go ahead, Trevor.
Please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to also add another thing on the emulator is that we also have a Linux emulator, which allows you to. We also have in that same link area that Shawn mentioned. We have a section on how to use Linux emulator for Linux or Mac OS, and so you can also use that. And it also has a UI as well.
Yeah, it's essentially the same that you install on Windows, but it's running in a container.
Exactly.
And there's a couple of things about signing access to it that they walk you through very, very carefully. I don't have a Mac or a Linux box easily near me, otherwise I would show that as well. But the experience once you have it installed is identical because it's the same code.
Yes, exactly. It's always great to see people using the Linux emulator.
Definitely. So Shawn, you mentioned you had a couple of other engagements where you're using Cosmos DB and you often start the development with the emulator. I was wondering if you could talk more about the development process and what kind of things you like to test there. What do you like to test in the actual prod environment, and how do you go about transitioning from the local environment to the cloud environment?
Sure. For me, I'm spending most of the time in the emulator testing the actual workflow of whatever the project is. So I'm not trying to, I think it's more important to see what I don't test in it. And that is problems of scale, performance. All of those aren't indicative of the cloud product, because the cloud product usually has more iron than we have on our dev boxes, especially, since our dev boxes have, many other things running at the same time. So I use it primarily for functional testing. So making sure that as we insert new objects, that queries work and that our unit tests against the local DB work. Directly unit testing that. Now, I'm typically in development as well, having the ability to wipe and recreate that database, usually through code, even though the emulator's there, because you're able to delete entire containers and even delete entire databases if you need to directly from the UI. And so that becomes a fairly low-hanging fruit. We can get this going. We can look at this, and in a lot of these cases, I'm using it in a mixed system where we do have, Azure SQL or local SQL databases where we're using some data, and then we're using Cosmos for others. Because for me, using a document database has real world benefits when you're dealing with hierarchies instead of related tables. And so this isn't a replacement for SQL Azure. It's for me, it's an and, right? I'm going to use this and this. Maybe I do the top level searching in Cosmos DB, but then when I want to get, the complete list of sales or whatever, where I want a typical SQL Server instance somewhere, because I'm going to be doing data warehousing or reporting or other things that there's a lot more choices in the SQL space for. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I agree. Definitely +1 on mostly for functional testing.
Yeah.
By the way, for folks who are curious, even internally within Cosmos DB, when we build our client SDKs and add new functionality, we always test against the emulator as well in a lot of our own local development.
Yeah, and it's just you're burning less resources overall, and you're getting that same experience. Like, I've never run into this only works in the emulator and doesn't work in Cosmos DB or vice versa, except for some of the features that are listed in the documentation, most of which I don't run into. You'll find that in the emulator, you may get some false positives around performance of cross-partition queries, because you're dealing with usually lower amounts. But I've been able to, in the instance, easily insert 1 million records and be able to query against it pretty quickly and all of that. So I'm pretty impressed with the emulator on the whole. It's not a proxy. I wouldn't be surprised if it's using the same code that the live service is using. But if it's not, it's an impressive copy.
That's awesome to hear.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. And then also for people who are, let's say, just trying out Cosmos DB and then they want to use the Linux emulator to get started, how easy is it for them to just go from, I have an application, small application running on the emulator to I now want to move on to Azure? How is that transition?
Really the difference between the two instances is is changing your connection string. So you may have noticed in my example here that I have the connection string here in my development app settings in a .NET instance. Of course, this could be other things, because my expectation is when we go to deploy this or start using that, we're just going to change this. This is the development connection string, and then when we deploy this app to a container or wherever we're going to deploy this app in Azure, we're going to go ahead and set that actual Azure connection string, and nothing else changes, because the way you set up the throttling and the scalability, etc., throwing more compute resources at it, that's all outside the context of this. That's all in setting up when you create your database. And in this case, when we go to production, just like we would with SQL, we're changing the connection string and going about our day. There isn't anything different between the two, or at least I haven't run into any.
Oh, cool. That's super easy to shift over from, local testing to maybe production environments.
Or even having a staging where you go against
staging, exactly.
a staging live Azure hosted to see how that works, and then of course a third connection string for when you're actually going into production. And that's been typical because I usually have a smaller instance of Cosmos DB for the staging, because that's really just to run through more tests, make sure it works correctly with live, and then production, of course, will be sometimes a larger instance of Cosmos DB or a Cosmos DB with more compute resources.
Sounds good. Yeah. Go ahead. We've got one question from the audience here. So folks, keep the questions coming. They're really awesome. Question is, how does Cosmos DB emulator handle or support user permissions?
I haven't run into that, and I don't think it does. The idea of tying it to user permissions isn't something I've ever done, and I don't think in the UI. Let's take a look. Where is Edge? There we go. I don't believe there is any place to put the idea of permissions at the item level or the row level in the UI here.
Would you like to show your screen here? Just what you're flunking around.
Oh. It says I'm sharing. Are you not seeing my screen?
Sounds good. No, looks good.
Okay, great. Sorry about that if it stopped.
No, that works.
Okay. And as I'm looking through this, I don't really see anything that is going to allow us to do user level permissions. So I don't think so in the emulator unless I'm missing it, but it's certainly never come up in my case. Just make sure there isn't an option here now. I'm sure Scale won't allow us to do it. Yeah, I don't think there is going to be a way to do that here. And I haven't used it before. I've always used data inside of the documents to indicate who the user was, and I typically do the authentication outside of that. Certainly for cross clients or multi-tenant, you're going to want more protection against that. But I wish I had a better answer for you, honestly.
That's a fair point. I think go ahead, Steph. Sorry.
No. I was just going to mention that, yeah, this is about right. It doesn't support the user permissions because, as we mentioned, this is just an emulator of the service. Not all of the features that are supported in production today are supported in the Linux emulator. In the documentation, we do share some of the things that we don't support fully, but we do, yeah, exactly. We have a couple of differences on there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this will walk you through what it doesn't support so that you can really see what the difference is. And this is directly in the link I have here. If you go to Shawn link Cosmos DB emulator, it'll take you directly to that page. So one of the interesting things for me has been that this emulator is an emulator for the SQL interface or the Mongo interface. And so regardless of how you're really using it, or if you're using those two instances at least, we've been able to test projects with it without really having to do anything but change connection strings. So it's kind of a fire and forget experience as far as I'm concerned. And I'll mention one other thing that I didn't show, and that is you can actually reset the entire emulator and start from scratch if that's really what you want to do, which is often helpful. Or even in my case, I can just delete the entire container. They're going to make sure that I know what I'm doing, and we can just start from scratch. And if you just want to get the itch scratched, you can actually start with a sample, and they'll create a sample DB with people in it that you can just start querying before you ever get to the point where you actually need to look at these things. And this is a great way to just like look at the API and see if that makes sense to you. These are really simple objects, but it's a nice, I don't have to think about or really rationalize about how partition queries work or any of that. Just get a thing here and I can start to look and see how, the SQL API or the Mongo API is different.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Shawn, for going over the emulator and some of the other desktop tooling that we have available. Really, really great session here.
Well, thank you very much. I hope everyone enjoyed it, and our next presenter will be very interesting, I'm sure.